Hey guys, I'm Amanda and this is my little suburban homestead. Today I'll be showing you how I make homemade pumpkin pie from scratch, and I'll share with you my 5 tips for the perfect Thanksgiving pie. The first thing that we need to do is roast the pumpkins for our pumpkin puree. Now you can buy the canned puree from the grocery store and your pumpkin pie will turn out just fine. However, if you take this extra step and roast the pumpkins yourself, I promise you will not be disappointed. These sugar pie pumpkins that I have here are the most common. However, you do not have to use sugar pie pumpkins. You can use Cinderella pumpkins, Dickinson pumpkins, fairy tale pumpkins, really any kind of baking pumpkin that has a sweet, soft flesh and isn't very stringy and watery like a carving pumpkin. Now that we're finished scooping the seeds out from the pumpkins, I set those aside so that we can roast these later. They make a really good snack, either for yourself or for your chickens if you have them. I placed the halves of the pumpkins flesh side down on a baking sheet that's lined with parchment paper. We'll bake these at 400 degrees for about 45 minutes. While those are in the oven roasting, I'm going to get started on the pie crust. To make the pie crust, we'll start with 1 1/4 cup of all-purpose flour. I like to use unbleached flour. To that, we'll add 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And this is my secret ingredient to this crust. We are going to add 1 teaspoon of cinnamon. And this is just going to help add some additional flavor to your crust and make it a little bit more seasonal. Give that a stir. Next, we're going to mix in the cold butter. I've had this butter in the freezer just to make sure that it's very cold. The secret to a really good pie crust is to make sure that your ingredients are cold and that they stay cold. Using this pastry cutter, I'm just going to mix that butter in until it's about pea-sized. Once the butter is about pea-sized, I'm adding ice cold water, about a tablespoon at a time, until the dough forms. This usually takes about 3 to 5 tablespoons before the dough actually comes together. Once it comes together, you want to form the dough into a ball. And then you want to refrigerate this for about 1 hour. Our pumpkin halves have been out of the oven and cooling for about 30 minutes. They're no longer hot to the touch. And the way that you know that these are ready is that the skin has started to separate from the flesh inside, which is going to make it really easy for you to get to all that delicious pumpkin goodness in there. Now that these have cooled, we can go ahead and make our puree. Now I'm just going to pick these up. They're really cool. You can see it has all this really gorgeous caramelization there, and it just smells amazing. And I'm just going to use a spoon and just scoop the flesh right out and pop it into my blender. Now if you have a food processor, you can use that. I don't have one. All I have is this blender, so I'm just going to stick all of this pumpkin inside the blender. Sometimes you really just got to do the best you can with the tools you've got. We're going to upgrade tools. Noticing right now is that there is a lot of liquid water actually kind of coming out of this puree. Do you guys see this liquid pulling up around the edges of the bowl? What that's telling me is that my puree is very wet. And a wet puree means a wet pie, and nobody wants a wet pie. You need just a few things to strain out the extra liquid in your puree. Here I have a large bowl that's going to catch all of our excess liquid. I have a strainer, and this is a pretty fine mesh strainer, but I do want to preserve as much of the puree as I possibly can. So in addition to that, I'm actually going to just use one of these flour sack towels, and I'm going to set that over and use it to squeeze out the excess liquid. So we'll just and then I'm going to pour the puree into the towel and squeeze out all the liquid. Leave it to sit, and it is going to drain out all of the excess liquid, but I actually like to squeeze the liquid out. That way I make sure I get a nice thick puree. I was able to drain out quite a bit of liquid just by squeezing it. And I could continue to squeeze this and get a lot more liquid out of there, but I don't need it to be completely free from any liquid. I just want to drain off that excess liquid. So if I were to open this up, you'll be able to see that the consistency of my puree has changed. It's definitely not as wet. It almost is like a Play-Doh consistency. It definitely, we have definitely got out a lot more of the moisture. We are not going to just throw this away. We are actually going to save it, because here on our little suburban homestead, we actually like to save and use everything with as little waste as possible. So I'll use this either in a pumpkin bread recipe or maybe some pancakes, but it'll definitely get used. No matter what you're making, the quality of your ingredients is really going to affect the taste of your food. For the pie filling, I'm using our homemade pumpkin puree, farm fresh eggs that I get from my cousin who raises chickens. I've sourced the cream from a local dairy. This is actually in our grocery stores here locally, so it makes it really accessible. Anytime you can find something that is produced locally, it's always going to be a better option for you. For this recipe and for my third tip, I'm going to be using eggnog. This is just going to add to the flavor. In a large bowl, we're going to beat the eggs. Next, we're going to add 2 cups of the pumpkin puree. One cup of eggnog. And 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. Next, I'm adding 3/4 a cup of brown sugar, half a teaspoon of sea salt, and finally I'll add 1 teaspoon of ground cinnamon, a half of a teaspoon of ground ginger, a 1/4 of a teaspoon of ground cloves, and 1/8 of a teaspoon of nutmeg. We'll stick this in the fridge while we prepare the pie crust. It's been about an hour, so I've removed the dough from the refrigerator and I'm rolling it out on a smooth floured surface. Once the dough is about 1/8 of an inch thick, I'll take my pie pan and measure to make sure that I've made it large enough. Very gently, I'm pulling the pie crust up. I didn't use enough flour, so it stuck a little bit, which is fine. You just need to be careful that you don't tear it when picking it up. I like to use this quartering method to get the dough into my pie pan, but there's lots of different ways you can do this. This just works best for me. Once I have the dough in the pan, I'm going to make sure that it's snug in the corners of the pie, making sure not to stretch the dough. Then I fold under any excess dough that might be hanging over the edge. And finally, I'm crimping the edge with my fingertips. Don't let this part intimidate you, it's really not that difficult, and it doesn't need to be perfect. Perfection is boring. Using a fork, I'm piercing the crust to make sure it doesn't bubble during the pre-bake. Now I'm lining it with parchment paper. And adding in the pie weights. I use dried beans that I keep in the pantry specifically for this purpose. I've also seen people use rice, or you can also use actual pie weights. Dried beans work great. I've preheated the oven to 425 degrees and will bake the crust for about 10 to 12 minutes in this really hot oven. Baking it at this high temperature at first will help the crust keep its shape. Once the first round is done, we'll remove the pie weights. The parchment paper cools really fast, but the beans are very hot, so you really want to be careful when you do this. Then we'll reduce the temperature to 350 degrees. And return the crust to the oven. It'll bake for about another 6 to 8 minutes. Now it's time to add the filling to the crust. temperature goes back up to 375. I'm being very careful not to slosh around the pie too much. In fact, some people actually recommend filling the pie crust in the oven, but I find as long as I'm careful, I'm able to get it in the oven and not have anything spill over the edge. The pie should be done baking after about 45 minutes to an hour. It's ready when the edges have set and there's a very slight jiggle to the center 4 to 5 inches. To prevent the pie from cracking, I'm cooling it in the oven. I've turned it off and will leave the door slightly ajar so it cools down and doesn't continue to bake. While pumpkin pie is my son's favorite dessert, it's not exactly one of mine. The way that I prefer my pumpkin pie is with a large dollop of whipped cream. To make the homemade whipped cream, I'm adding 1 cup of heavy whipping cream, 2 tablespoons of granulated sugar. Normally I would use a powdered sugar, but didn't have any on hand, so this will work just fine. 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. And I'm using a hand mixer to blend that all together. It takes a few minutes for it to thicken and come together, but once it does, it comes together really fast. Now that the pie is cooled, I've removed it from the oven, and it's time for the number 1 tip. You can make this homemade from scratch pumpkin pie ahead of time, so you don't have to do all that baking while you're trying to prepare your Thanksgiving feast. Directions for freezing and thawing this pie can be found in the description below. I'm not going to be freezing this pie. I'm going to go ahead and add some whipped cream onto it, and we're going to give it a taste. I've actually made this pie specifically for my son. Like I said, pumpkin pie is his absolute favorite dessert. Welcome. You excited? Yeah. Dig in. What do you think?
Amazing.
Thank you for joining us on our little suburban homestead while I made homemade pumpkin pie from scratch. Please comment down below and let me know your family's favorite holiday desserts. Please like and subscribe for more homegrown and homemade content.